Okay, welcome everybody to another episode of the Icelandic Roots podcast. Today, my guest is Audrey, who is joining us from Spain. So maybe buenos dias, or is that mainly just for good
Buenas
morning?
noches para mí, sí.
It is morning for me, so maybe that works. Golden Dian, Golden Dog, buenos dias, good day, good evening, welcome. So Audrey is originally from Seattle, Washington, and then went to school in Washington, D.C., and has now graduated, with a Bachelor's of Science in Foreign Service. Could you maybe explain, just from your article, which is why I reached out to do the podcast with you, and anyone listening, I would really recommend reading. Audrey wrote a really interesting article about her experience on the Snorri Program just this past summer. And we're going to aim to maybe elaborate on some of those ideas in the conversation here today. But just kind of going over your quick bio there, I quickly did a search for what that degree entails. And that alone seems like really interesting and kind of wide-ranging. So you could maybe start off by explaining what interested you in those studies and some of the things that maybe you learned and where it's taken to you in your current situation of living in Spain, and if those things are connected at all.
Sure. Yeah, I was always interested in foreign policy and international affairs, and mostly from a cultural lens.
Hmm.
A lot of just, I feel like, from my experience growing up in a really diverse America, and wondering about how that came to be and what all these other cultures have in common, have to offer, have differences. And then I solidified my decision to study foreign service when I went to the Dominican Republic when I was 16 on a US State Department sponsored exchange program. And over the summer, I stayed with a family in a rural, like Pueblo. And it really significantly altered the course of my life because I just had the most amazing time in in a situation in a town that I couldn't fathom before, with washing like clothes in the river, and
Yeah.
houses without doors.
Wow. Hmm.
And I had actually the best host family ever there. And they really inspired me to just keep pursuing, I don't know, this goal of just going out and seeing what more there is to offer, and then also contextualizing all of my experiences and understanding them through education.
Hmm.
And that's ultimately why I wanted to study this, not just to travel and see, because every place and every people comes with so much historical and cultural background that, like I said, contextualizes everything that we have and we see in front of us. It's the exact same situation in Iceland. And I
Right.
myself am part of that contextualization of Icelandic history.
Hmm.
Um, so, yeah, that's originally why I wanted to study it. And then I focused on migration and refugee studies
Okay.
primarily, and more from like a cultural, anthropological lens of
Mm-hmm.
why people choose to move
Hmm.
and what are the factors that go into deciding that, and how migration influences the way people view themselves, the way they view their communities, the way they view language,
Hmm.
and also, of course, how foreign policy and different actors and different socioeconomic political circumstances combine to create migration. And so, of
Hmm.
course, Iceland has its own story
Yeah.
in
Right.
this, directly related to my own history.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a really, really interesting, and I certainly agree. Um, I think these are fascinating topics and ones that, although maybe not everyone chooses, I'm going to follow these ideas for a career path, I think no matter what, these are things that are interesting to people because they're very much like the fabric, certainly the fabric of society in United States and Canada. But also, like, no matter where you are in the world, if you're on the sort of other end of the immigration equation, and if people have left your country to maybe live in United States or Canada or anywhere else in the world, And I would agree, actually. You were asking me earlier before we started recording about my experience. And what I didn't mention is I also did the Snorri internship. So last summer, a year before you went on the Snorri program in 2024, this past summer. And so that had me spending the whole summer at the Emigration Center Museum in Hofsos, which you would have went to as well. And so that really drove home for me, at least, really trying to think about these factors like what you just explained. And in Iceland, um, I would like to know what you think about this too. I found that in general, from learning the history of when the first people, settled the land there, all the way up to the recent emigration history, recent meaning, last 100 to 150 years, all of this seemed like, oh, I can actually grasp it, right? It's still complex and there's a lot of different factors, but it is simple enough that you can kind of hold the timeline in your head and you can, get a grasp on all the different factors. It's a little less complicated than histories of maybe other countries have been.
Of course. Yeah, I think it's human nature to want to know where you came from
Hmm.
and to know what that means for each individual person. And I think especially in the case of the United States and Canada, if you're not a Native American or First Nations, you come from somewhere else. And I think it's always in the back of our minds in a sense, and especially because the relationship to home is so complicated because it comes from so much violence, persecution, poverty, really, really hard and intense topics that cause people to move or cause, colonization to happen. And so having a connection to a homeland, I think, is incredibly difficult when you're, for anyone, colonizer or colonized or emigrant or immigrant. And I think in the case of Iceland, I always had Iceland as sort of a place in my mind of, thinking about wanting to know where I came from and always knowing that like Iceland was a part of that lineage, my like great great grandfather, but never really being able to have the words to describe what that means or even what that looks like because going on the Snorri program this summer was my very first time in the country and also probably my first critical like engagement with the country because I wasn't a part of some sort of Icelandic cultural society back at home, or my family wasn't, involved in that. So it kind of it came from me personally and my interests, and it was overwhelming to see. I think the land for the first time because first of all, it's unlike anything that I've seen in the U.S.
Uh-huh.
or in my travels. It's very distinct.
Hmm.
It almost feels like you're falling off the edge of the earth, or if you walk a little further, you'll get to the moon or something,
Hmm.
um, which is incredible. But also, I don't know, I kept thinking about the people that came before me in my history and where
Hmm.
they were in all these places and what they saw and what they experienced. Um, and I think being there and seeing things, learning the history, actually really connected me
Hmm.
to that homeland and that sense of home.
Hmm.
But again, it's not really my own.
Hmm.
And I think that it's definitely I don't know, it's hard to not have like a super super strong sense of home that you can trace back to. Like for example, the cousins I stayed with
Hmm.
in Iceland, like his family, I mean our family, had lived there in the same land that he still lives in for who knows how long. You
Right.
trace it back hundreds and hundreds of years.
Hmm.
And I think there's something incredibly special about that and something I'm honestly quite jealous of. I think
Hmm. Hmm.
that would be an interesting feeling to have,
Hmm.
one that I will never have because that hasn't been my lived experience.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I'm sure even if not everyone is able to articulate it as clearly as that, I think this underlies a lot of our experiences, being people who have connections to different European countries or wherever your heritage comes from. And yeah, exactly like you say. And I think Iceland has been special in that way that you can at least go and find, the old family farm, or find places that are written about in genealogy documents. And I think it goes back to that point I was trying to make, which is exactly that: because Iceland is so relatively small, uh, culturally, societal wise and historically speaking, you can kind of narrow it down. And being someone who's maybe seeking for that sense of home and trying to find their past connections, it seems like it's easier in a sense. But then there's also like this net around it, such as the Snorri Program or Icelandic roots. There are like actual real tools, genealogical tools and databases that do make it easier for us as well to find those connections out. And I did have a question thinking about like your studies and such. I imagine that this sort of research and schooling casts quite a broad net to really get a grasp about global cultures. And you explained that you didn't really have much of a too much of an understanding about Iceland before you went on the Snorri program. Was it ever like mentioned in your studies at all? Had you ever had like any references to Iceland in any of your schooling or studies?
No, never. I
Mm.
think I think I mean, yeah, the nature of it being such an incredibly small country doesn't lend
Mm-hmm.
itself incredibly well to sort of impacting global politics or, being the source of I mean, there's far larger immigrations that
Mm-hmm.
happened in many other
Right.
places. But it's interesting to have my own connection to my studies,
Mm-hmm.
and especially being able to research, like, mass migration in Iceland caused by natural disasters
Mm-hmm.
and poverty, starvation, and so many of the themes are the same everywhere in the world.
Right. Right.
And, um, it's definitely hard to reckon with that. I think it's hard to go back and to study your history
Hmm.
and to realize that so much of it was born out of a lot of struggle.
Yeah.
Um, but I think there's also something really healing about, I don't know, connecting with those parts
Hmm.
and kind of connecting them also on a larger scale of
Mm-hmm.
just, something, a phenomenon of humanity that's happened since the dawn of
Mm-hmm.
time.
Mm-hmm.
People moved and settled Iceland. People move and they move,
Mm-hmm.
and families start over, and they, at the end of
Mm-hmm.
the day. And I think I love finding those lines
Hmm.
that all weave and come together, and really like contextualizing history in a major way. Because I think, at least for me, it's not
Hmm.
like the migration in my family happened one or two generations ago. It was,
Right.
130 years ago. So that is quite ancient.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's the nature, like you said, of Iceland being so small and so connected
Mm-hmm.
doesn't really make it feel like that.
Yeah.
And it's such a unique situation because, I mean, what other country in the world really has that genealogical
Mm-hmm.
database? And then also has just such close-knit, like, genealogical relations
Hmm.
that literally make everyone family,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like, that's incredibly unique, and I really enjoy being a part of that, something so unique in the world.
Yeah, no, it's insanely unique. And that's maybe why, like, I asked the question. I figured that it wasn't really a talking point in your studies because it never seems to be. And I wonder, like, why? To me, this is like, should maybe be the first case study that
Mm,
people interested in this go through, because then it becomes easier to, like you say, see the patterns that then take place because it's similar ideas. I would say maybe the one thing that Iceland avoided, large scale migration because of, would have been because of war, right? There was not necessarily any large
right.
scale wars over the last 100, 200 years that caused people and families to have to move. But then they certainly were affected later on during World War II, where that changed the culture tremendously, albeit in a sort of different way, but at least exposed them and sort of connected them to the greater of the world. Yeah. And speaking more onto like your family history, you kind of described in the article that you wrote how there was sort of a, some of your relatives had migrated, had left for North America, and then another group or a few individuals, or maybe just one, I forget exactly, stayed, and then those are who you connected with for your homestay during the Snorri Program.
Yeah, that's correct. So my great great grandfather, Helgi Thorgrimsson, immigrated with his mother
Hmm.
in 1889, and he had a half brother with this same mother, who stayed behind in Iceland, and he is the great grandfather of the cousin that I stayed with when I was in Iceland. So my cousin that I stay with, Gunnar, and I, we share the same great grandmother. So his great great grandmother and my great 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 grandmother.
Yeah. And that cousin Gunnar is like kind of based in a farm or area that has been a long time in the family.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
in the Northeast,
Mm,
and
mm,
so basically sort of the same place,
yeah.
which is really quite fascinating, and it's probably the most beautiful land I've ever seen in my life. So
Yeah, you have actually a really, really wonderful photo in the article with the horses and with, I don't know, it looks like a volcanic sort of mountain in the background. And it's just
yeah,
really
that
framed
was
wonderfully.
just from their backyard,
Yeah.
and all their that was the mares, the
Mm,
foals that they keep in the back.
hmm.
And I take film photos, so that was just one of
Okay.
my photos
That's
on
what I
film
thought.
that I had been taking around the property. So
Mm. Yeah, it's a really, really, I just love that picture actually. Um, yeah, what was it like? Because that's a bit more like I know when I went on Snorri, a lot of us stayed around Reykjavik actually in the surrounding area. I went rural myself, but not too far, just down by Kvassfallar, which is a bit more east of Selfoss. So, an hour maybe bus ride from Reykjavik. Wasn't that remote. Whereas up in the Northeast,
yeah.
that's a bit more of a journey to get there.
Oh, truly, and it was the most remote I've ever been in my life. The closest town, I mean, if you can really call it that from our standards, is Kopasker,
Hmm.
and that's about 20-30 minutes drive away.
Wow.
And so basically, we have in the immediate area where they live, the farm, and then, a mile down the road, another house, another farm, mile back, another farm. And then down the road a bit, there's one of those tiny little churches. And then, down the road even more, there's one school. And if you keep driving like about 15 minutes past the church, you come across Osbergi National Park, which is basically the main tourist attraction around there.
Hmm.
And attached to it is a gas station. And that pretty much makes up the entire immediate area of where they live.
Wow.
Um, and my cousin, his partner's daughter, worked at the gas station over the summer.
Hmm.
And it seemed like a hot spot in the community. The few times I was there, I ran into people that I saw around. So it was really unique, I
Hmm.
think, but also so lovely
Yeah.
because you just really get to bask in the tranquility of nature, like,
Hmm.
so far from
Hmm.
everything else, and also far from tourists, and I think
Hmm.
especially in the summer,
Hmm.
you're hard pressed to find a place in Iceland
Yep.
without a million Americans, a million Canadians, and other tourists roaming
Hmm.
around.
Hmm.
So I think it's really unique in that way. And despite how rural it was, honestly, in a way, it felt even more connected than
Hmm.
the places I've lived in the US
Hmm.
because so Gunnar, his family lives nearby.
Hmm.
His son lives nearby. His parents live nearby, and his partner Margaret, her brother lives behind the house, and like pretty much the nearest farm behind the house. So he was over all the time. Gunnar would visit his parents all the time. His son would come over all the time, and that's not something I've ever experienced in my life.
Yeah.
I've always had, extended family living really far away from me,
Hmm. Hmm.
like plane hours and plane rides away. And I mean, the benefit of a small country, right?
Right.
And not only that, but the community was also quite close knit. I mean,
Hmm.
while I was there, the all the women in the community, which I think maybe total like 50 or 100
Hmm.
in in a quite like large square foot area, they organized a horse riding trip
Hmm.
and they themed it as a Barbie theme.
Oh wow.
So all the women dressed up as Barbie from the movie to go on this horseback riding trip, and they had like wigs and like costumes, and they had a costume competition for who, had the best Barbie.
Wow.
And then all the men, they dressed as Kens, and they had like t-shirts that mimic abs,
Hmm.
and they had like Elton John like sparkly sunglasses, and they were in charge of organizing like all the food and all the
Hmm.
logistics for all the women who were going on this horseback riding trip. And it was really a joyful experience and so just rare, I think,
Hmm.
to come across a Barbie themed horseback riding trip in rural Iceland. I did not have that on my bingo card for sure, and really felt more close knit than pretty much any place that I've lived,
Yeah.
small city or in the rural US as well.
That's really kind of funny too, because like just the idea of what they were basing it around, Barbie, and yeah, like the I'm sure based around mainly the recent movie, right? The summer before.
Yeah,
So that is kind of funny because this is this really rural community, which by all measures is totally disconnected from the rest of the world. But here they
right,
are, like centering themselves around this cultural phenomena that,
exactly,
is
and still
fundamentally
vibrant.
based and comes from the United States.
Well, I think that that goes to show like the really, really strong connections between Iceland and the US. Of
Hmm.
course, like we have World War II and the
Hmm.
American occupation, the American military base. And so
But we
obviously
also have
some
Barbie.
right, yeah. So obviously like a lot of the infrastructure is American made or American influenced. You can see that when you drive around the country. And
Hmm.
but also I think that this tie is especially transient because of the immigration connection.
Mm.
Like for instance, the um, God, what's the word I'm looking for? The Fjökunan,
Hmm.
and how the Fjökunan actually came from the like New Icelandic community in Gimli.
Hmm. Right, right.
Actually, I mean, not the idea of it, but
Hmm.
the act of choosing a woman
Hmm.
and having her paraded in this way.
Hmm.
So that tradition actually came from Canada
Hmm.
and was um, then started back in
Hmm.
the motherland. So I
Hmm.
think you can really see a lot of the connection here, and people, of course, traveling back and forth. I mean,
Hmm.
mostly the Icelanders go to like Florida, but
Yes, right. Or Spain. A lot
or
of
yeah, or
in
Spain
terms of
too,
traveling to warm places. But yeah,
right?
Florida, I met a lot of Icelanders who would go there, or New York, or yeah, going over to Spain or other warm places.
Yeah, and I think the Icelanders are aware of the migration story too,
Hmm.
and plays a decent part in probably their education and historical learning. Not I obviously not positive about that, but I can
Yeah,
imagine
yeah,
it's a significant event.
yeah, yeah. Certainly so. But I did find, in my experience at least, they still had a lot of questions. I think this is something where Icelandic roots, I think, really kind of fills a void because their genealogy, as far as you're concerned, if you're living in Iceland, it's mainly just connecting you to your fellow citizens that are there currently, or maybe, they've moved abroad, but, they were born in Iceland or something like this. Whereas, you know, people like us, where the connection goes back 100 years or more, that genealogy is kind of lost to the average Icelander today, except for maybe family records or, thanks to Icelandic roots, having it in a database. But if you're just going based on, Icelandingabok, Snorri actually helps so that we can get added to it. And so I think it's
Right,
bridging that gap a bit. But Icelandic roots really fills that void if you are in Iceland and you are wondering, but what happened to those relatives that moved to North America? That allows those kind of connections to be um, reconnected if they're interested in, connecting a bit more deeper to that, which I think I personally would be. I think it would be equally the reverse. If I was, living in Iceland, I would be just as interested in what happened to my relatives that left the
yeah.
country.
In my case, the cousin that I stayed with, his brother had done a bunch of genealogical
Mm,
research into the immigrated family,
hmm.
all stemming from their great grandmother Gudrun.
Hmm.
And so I actually went to Gunnar's mother's house, Marin. I talked about this in the article, like a 90-year-old woman who is the granddaughter of Gudrun. So she was her grandma. And her son had collected all of this genealogical research into all these pamphlets that she kept in her house. She kept in her living room. So as soon as I arrived, she whipped them out and she, showed me
Yeah, yeah.
the history of her grandmother,
Hmm.
written down, and the family tree and photos of herself and their old house. And then she had pages on all of the extended family. So all of the extended family that was listed in this pamphlet, except for mine, was all in Canada, primarily like in Manitoba.
Hmm.
And then
Interesting.
mine is the only like US side of it.
Hmm.
And she asked me to, look at the family tree and point out where my grandfather was
Hmm.
on the tree. And she had said that she had had Canadians like reach out to her from, doing their own research and had actually come to meet her and showed
Hmm.
me a photo of them and asked if I knew them. And of
Wow.
course I didn't, but I think it's cute.
Yeah.
Um, and so it definitely seemed like there was a genuine interest. And I
Hmm.
think something that kept coming up for me and I kept feeling constantly while I was there is this feeling that we're not strangers.
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
I don't know if I could exactly call us family in the sense
Right.
that you call your immediate, family
Hmm.
family, but we're not strangers. And I didn't only feel that with the family that I stayed with, but also I think Icelanders as a whole, and especially the other Snorri participants.
Hmm.
It's like you can feel that we have something like kind of binding us together
Hmm.
that's a little more abstract than we can really name.
Hmm.
And so I just kept coming back to that phrase, like, we're not strangers.
Hmm.
Like all of us in this way. Like, yes, this is the first time we're meeting. This is the first time you've ever heard of me. When you got this phone call about can this random girl stay in your house? I mean, that's crazy. And it literally qualifies as the definition of a stranger, but also not. Like,
Uh-huh.
and I think, we're not strangers because my grandfather's name is in a book in your mom's house.
Hmm.
So there's something there. And it was really special. And I think, especially to meet her, such, who really enjoys learning about all
Hmm.
the extended family and collecting history and sort of a record keeper of
Hmm.
the family lineage and the history.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed that, even though we couldn't have a conversation at all. We just
Right.
sort
Because she
of
didn't speak
sat.
English.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
neither the cousin
Okay.
that I stayed with or her spoke English. So
Wow.
did a lot of pointing and
Hmm.
sign language and
Hmm.
you know,
Which is another interesting idea too, right? Is how can you be family with someone where you don't even speak the language, the same language, right? That is a
yeah.
question too, right? To kind of consider. And how much does that matter? How much does that factor into it? That's
Yeah, definitely.
interesting.
I think it's really interesting how fast Icelandic seemed to be lost between
Hmm.
all of our
Right.
common immigration stories. It's
Mm-hmm.
pretty much one generation, it seems
Mm-hmm.
like, for most of the people I've talked to.
Mm-hmm.
It's like they moved to the US and they never speak Icelandic to their children again.
Yeah. Yeah. Which maybe goes to show if a language can be lost that quickly, it could also be brought back that quickly too.
That's definitely true. And I
Mm-hmm.
think language is important, but I don't know how much weight it has in this sort of historical feeling of family.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's a good
Maybe that's
question.
a hot take on my part, but
But I think about history in general. I mean, so much of what we learn about history is, you know, either translated or written in the language that we're learning it from. But we're learning about histories from like maybe ancient Greeks or something like this, which they are existing in a totally different language bubble, but we're learning it in our own language. So yeah, I guess like fundamentally, once you translate it into a language that you understand, I don't know if that has to be such a barrier, but there certainly is something lost in translation. I know that. I mean, reading a lot of the
true.
Icelandic poems, I know that it's kind of amazing how a lot of them can still match up when they're translated to English. But even as good as they are, I'm reading it and thinking, like, I will never know really how to experience this poem in the same way as if I read it in the original language, if I read it in Icelandic.
I think like humanity has a common language, and
Mm-hmm.
that's not something we can understand, but something
Mm-hmm.
we feel. And I think that's more what I align myself with, especially in Iceland. But I understand what you're saying,
Mm-hmm.
and I do feel the same way. Like the experience of kind of knowing this language creates an entirely new perception
Mm-hmm.
of how you're viewing things. But for me, I think it's less about the language and the like specifics of the language, and more about how the language allows people to act or creates personalities.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think languages itself come with certain sort of personality traits,
Yeah.
or the way that you express yourself in each language is different. Like the way I express myself in Spanish is the way
Mm-hmm.
that different than the way I express myself in English. And I
Mm-hmm.
think I was curious to know like what I don't know what am I missing? What is that like feeling or personality lost in translation in Icelandic that I'm not getting? But also conversely, even if the language isn't passed down, is there this kind of unwritten sort of personality of the language that is passed down?
Mm-hmm.
And to me, I sort of found that there was.
Yeah.
The similarities between the way my grandfather
Mm-hmm.
speaks and acts and my Icelandic family speaks and acts
Hmm.
reminded me so much of my host family in the Northeast. And I think that I don't think it's a coincidence, is what I'm saying. I
Mm-hmm.
think
Mm-hmm.
there's a reason. I think there's an obvious connection between why my family doesn't have, let's say, like, the Japanese language or
Mm.
Japanese like mannerisms. They
Right.
have Icelandic mannerisms. Like
Yeah.
that's directly connected to a history that's now 130 years in the past, but is
Wow.
still relevant in that sense. And just random things too, like
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, different traditions that I didn't even realize were Icelandic until I
Mm-hmm.
got there, and I was like, maybe that is.
Hmm.
Or the love for licorice that pervades in my family. Didn't really connect that until I was eating licorice flavored everything. I was wondering why that is.
Hmm.
Maybe taste buds also have some sort of genetic,
Wow.
transient, some sort of sweet tooth passed down for generations. But
Yeah.
I don't know, these were just things that I was thinking about while I was there and were really fascinating to me because that was probably the greatest connection that I had
Hmm.
was in that way of how people laugh the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's actually a really good point. And like you say, I don't know how much that needs like scientific data to back it up. Like, I think you're right. I mean, if your grandparents that, have a history of being Icelandic, if they have similar mannerisms and similar way that they talk as the people that you're meeting in Iceland today, maybe, like you say, there's a connection there, right? It's probably
Yeah,
not coincidence that they act more that way and not, you know, in different sort of way that another culture would. And I think that actually is really really good point. And maybe that kind of goes back to just the idea of what family is, and fundamentally, no matter who you are or where you're from, there is always going to be some connection. And yeah, I mean, there is sort of a universality to how humans interact with the world and how we engage with our surroundings. But then you do notice, certainly in some cultures, there are differences, and it's more prominent in different places. And what I have found even more interesting is then exploring the other Scandinavian cultures, and then furthermore seeing the similarities between Icelanders and, say in Denmark, or also I noticed in Finland, which I was there recently, and Finnish, from what I understand, is the most different Scandinavian language. Like it's kind of went
right.
in its own direction, and I could certainly see that in just the way that words are spelt and such. But just hearing the language spoken on the streets, I recognize so much of the characteristics and mannerisms, or kind of the attitude and emotion, that was so similar to Icelandic. Like it felt very Icelandic in the way that they spoke. That was at least my observation. And I think those sorts of connections are really cool to observe and
For sure.
pinpoint.
I'm also incredibly aware that a lot of this connection that I feel could entirely be placebo effect.
Sure.
And sometimes I think about if I had never known anything about my
Hmm.
Icelandic ancestry at all, if I had come to Iceland, would I have felt the same?
Hmm.
And that's something I definitely think about. If there's something else there behind the surface, or also behind the way I look physically, I think
Hmm.
it can be easier to align yourself with a place when you phenotypically look similar.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, yeah, whether you would like to admit that or not, I mean, I think that certainly does have an impact. And yeah, it's kind of a funny thing because I don't know if, well, I don't know. I tend to have thought throughout my life that I've had more of like a, based on my looks from like my dad's side of the family, which is like Irish, British, and French. But being in Iceland and being around that sort of a culture, I've had like lots of comments like, "Oh yeah, you definitely look like you're from Iceland." Oh really? I never really thought that. But
I mean, also Irish DNA is like of
yes,
women
sure.
is like 80% Gaelic, so I
Hmm.
mean,
Hmm.
all quite similar. But I think it's more like prescient for me now being in Spain because
Mm,
it's quite obvious to the Spanish that I'm not Spanish. So,
right. Right.
and it's something I'm aware of
Hmm.
in the way I'm perceived.
Hmm.
But it's not something that happened to me in Iceland
Yeah.
or that happens to me in Ireland.
Hmm. Yeah. I
And I
mean,
don't
it's
know what
interesting
effect
too.
that has on me
Yeah.
psychologically,
Hmm.
but I think that has some effect.
Well, and I would say as well, like being kind of primed for it, like with the Snorri program, that's such a unique experience in that I don't know, just the flow and the structure of it really does well and lends itself good to actually immersing you into that. And I'm sure, well, obviously, that has such a impact on it. Yeah, yeah, it's fascinating to think about.
Definitely.
Could you maybe say something to like why you're in Spain and what you do there? Because that's also quite interesting connection.
Sure, yeah. So I'm here doing a teaching fellowship
Hmm.
with the Ministry of Education. It
Okay.
actually has a program for Americans and Canadians.
Hmm.
So I work at a bilingual primary school that has a bilingual English and French program. So I don't speak French, so
Oh,
I
interesting.
teach in the
Yeah.
in the English program. So fourth, fifth, and sixth grade.
Hmm.
So that's what I'm doing here, and I
Yeah.
live in Madrid, the capital.
And how long have you been there for?
I only started working like 2 months ago.
Okay. Wow.
So yeah, but I'm planning to be here for at least 2 years.
Yeah. Yeah, well, yeah, like I said, I know a lot of Icelanders that go to Spain often. I think the move would be to go there in the wintertime. Would be a
True.
very nice time to travel there if you're from Iceland.
Enjoy more daylight.
Yeah, and some sunshine and some warmth. How
True.
much of an impact did you consider like the environment to have when you're thinking about these topics about, you know, how do you feel in a place, that connection? Because I know like personally I've only been to Iceland during kind of spring, summer, fall months. I still have yet to be there in the winter. And I wonder how much could I really understand about them as a people if I haven't experienced that, dark winter time that they have.
I feel the exact same way. I think it would alter your brain chemistry to
Hmm.
exist in that much darkness. And it's something I cannot fathom.
Hmm.
And something I'm not sure that I entirely want to, at least for an extended period of time.
Yeah.
Um, but I agree. I think there's something about topography and
Hmm.
biodiversity that really struck me because I'm looking around, I'm seeing so little trees
Hmm.
and so little biodiversity.
Hmm.
Like the only land mammals I'm seeing are sheep,
Yes.
and that is unlike anything I've known. And it feels so like inhuman in
Mm.
such a way. Like,
Hmm.
and it just makes me wonder, like, how were they surviving? How were they
Yeah.
surviving? And of course, obviously, the research and the lectures like tell us how. And
Hmm.
it's obviously not an idealized life. It's a hard life to
Hmm.
exist without so much of the fruits of nature. And I think that that also can explain a lot, I think, about, I don't know, the culture, the immigration as well. Like, I
Hmm.
think about, I thought I always had while I was there was, what would it have been like to immigrate from Iceland
Hmm.
to Seattle
Hmm.
and try an apple for the very first time, or
Yeah.
see like an apple orchard for the first
Yeah.
time,
Hmm.
and how shocking like it would have been, or I don't know, or maybe the homesickness you would have felt, or
Mm.
I don't know, like, what was going through their minds, like,
Yeah.
going from such such an extremely, like, extreme lack of biodiversity to
Hmm.
obviously what we have in the US and Canada is so much,
Right.
so many trees, so much agriculture, and
Mm-hmm.
I think it was hard for me to adjust at first because I'm not used to the lack of trees,
Mm-hmm.
and so yeah, I think it did play sort of a large effect. And I think I don't know, I think the same thing about like deserts.
Right.
Like I'm not a desert person
Mm-hmm.
and or like a really super warm weather climate person. I
Right.
know I
Right.
say that in Spain,
Yeah.
but
You'll
and I'm
get that
thinking like
experience now.
what about that aspect of my personality could be influenced by
Yeah.
genealogy too. I mean, this
Right.
is not my area of expertise at all. This is not what I study, but it's interesting things to think about. And
Yes.
I just contextualizing your whole life, like you start to
Mm-hmm.
wonder if like
Mm-hmm.
you only exist as a product of all of this history that has happened before you.
Right. And yeah, a lot of thoughts that I have on that too. And I think about, an entire lifespan for a person, for example, and I think about my own life, and I don't know if I want to, be 90 years old and still have those questions. I would like to personally figure out, like, would it really affect me if I spent a whole year in a place like Iceland where I experienced the darkness of the
Yeah,
winter? And then simultaneously, how would it change me and affect me spending a year or longer in, an equatorial country, a place
of
where
course.
the sun doesn't really change too much, or even like
Yeah.
right on the equator where it pretty much stays the same all year round? How much different would that make you as a person? Because I think certainly the environment does have a major effect on you.
Do you ever think about like who you would have become if your family had never emigrated?
Oh, that's
Like
really
who,
interesting.
like what you think they would have been, or who you would have been, or the opportunities they would have had or didn't have?
See, I feel like that's not even a question that I'm capable of pondering, right? Because my very existence draws together, people who came from different countries.
Right.
I can't even imagine, like, because it would only be half of me that would have
True.
lived in
Right.
Iceland, right? If my family
Yeah.
never left there, because that's only half of who I am, genetically speaking. So it's kind of an interesting question. Do you have thoughts on that?
I mean, I think, especially learning about the history and the conditions
Hmm.
for immigration and the conditions of my family specifically, which were also dictated to me by Marin.
Mm.
And it was really quite horrific. I mean, to
Hmm.
think about like the famine, like,
Yeah.
the starvation, the poverty, and and how it persisted for so long. And to think about how Iceland was on like the UN's developing world like database or whatever
Right.
until 1971. Like
Yeah.
that's a long time to struggle in that way. And I
Hmm.
think not that my family upon immigrating to the US did not struggle,
Right.
but I think I don't know, I think about how much every generation, how much they were able to accomplish and the different opportunities they have. And it sort of left me feeling grateful for the US and
Hmm.
patriotic in a way that I
Hmm.
don't normally feel. Um, and and also thinking about, I don't know, the conditions now and how much it's changed. And
Yeah.
I think you're right. There's no way to really, really think about that question
Hmm.
because hypotheticals like that are always impossible to answer. But I don't know. I don't know. My cousin, he had said something interesting, sort of upon learning about my family's farm in the US and how large it was and
Hmm.
whatever. And sort of made an aside comment about, oh, like maybe my great grandfather should have moved to the US too. And it was an aside, but it seems serious in a way.
Yeah.
And I think there is maybe an acknowledgement that maybe it was the right decision at the time. Um, and it's crazy for me to fathom that these decisions that they've made
Hmm.
have led me to exactly where I am
Right.
today.
Yeah.
Because I wouldn't call Seattle home if they never moved
Hmm.
there. And I wouldn't maybe have these opportunities if it wasn't for that. So I don't know, it's equal parts like curiosity,
Hmm.
gratefulness, maybe a little bit of jealousy as well. Like, would have liked to be a modern day Icelandic citizen.
Yeah. Right. Right. I
Um,
think there's lots of emotion behind answering questions like that. But I think as you spoke there, I realized like, okay, if it was a hypothetical situation and I was living in Iceland at any point in time in that sort of recent ish history, I think I definitely would have left. And I
Right.
only say that because today, even being a Canadian, I don't see myself, again, as I was saying, like getting towards the latter end of my life, having just lived here my whole life, even. And
Mm,
I'm similar experience when I came back from these travels and such. Every time I do come back home, I feel even more grateful and I understand more about Canada and where I am from.
exactly.
But it's still,
It teaches you just as much about yourself
yeah,
as the
and
place
where
you're
you're from. Um, but yeah, I always have this like a desire to go places, but then I also wonder too how much of that is because of the modern age, right? And I've spent even before the advent of YouTube videos and travel vlogs and such, even just as a kid watching movies, showing like The Lord of the Rings and the landscape of New Zealand and such. These sorts of ideas have been embedded in me from such a young age, making me want to go elsewhere in the world. And I don't know how confident I would have been being an Icelander and just looking at like a pamphlet about Canada and taking that
exactly.
incredible journey all that way. I don't know if I would have been confident enough to do it, but I think I would have wanted to have tried.
It would have been such a perilous and gut-wrenching decision and journey. I can't
Yeah.
even imagine.
Yeah.
And I would like to say I would be brave enough to make the same choice,
Hmm.
but really, I'm not entirely sure
Yeah.
that I would have been.
And it's also crazy to me to imagine as well, just based on how much Iceland has changed today. Like it just boggles my mind. I don't think you would have been able to describe to someone living in, well, even let's just take, yeah, say before World War II time period in Iceland and into the 1800s and 1700s. If you could go there and explain, like, 100 years, 200 years from now, it'll be really easy to go anywhere in the world that you would like. Reykjavik,
Yeah,
Keflavik would have this international airport and you would jump on a tube and be able to travel anywhere in the world. The world would be your oyster. You don't have to leave for good. You can just go for the winter. You can come back again. Like that is so insane to imagine. But then also too that Icelanders have a really, really, really high quality of life and that they are wealthy
of
and
course,
that they
yeah.
have all the safety and security of the best nation in the entire world would ever have. And to imagine that based on the poverty and the hardships and the struggles that they went through all those times prior. And I imagine like living under Danish rule, and at other points in time, you would maybe really feel like you were kind of this dismissed place in the middle of nowhere, and no one else in the
Yeah,
world really cared
sort of
about you.
condemned.
Hmm. It's crazy
Condemned
to
to
think about
darkness
that.
and, no agriculture.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel the same, and I think it's it's not only something I think about Iceland, I mean, I think about it all the time and everywhere I go.
Right.
And the scale of change that we've known in the last century is
Hmm.
grander than any scale of change. I mean, not even in the last century, in the
In the
last
last decade.
30, yeah, in the last decade even. I mean, it's greater than anything we could
Hmm.
have explained or imagined. And I think it's also why I find it really important to like meet my elders,
Hmm.
um,
Yes,
and
without a doubt.
sort of experience this and how how they grew up and how much has changed and how they process it and how
Hmm.
it influences everything. And yeah, I completely agree. It's really unimaginable, and I think I'm very happy and grateful to be an Icelandic American and all that entails,
Hmm.
or a new Icelander, as they
Yes.
would say.
Yeah, likewise. It's taught me a lot, and I continue to learn a lot because of it. And it has been a jumping off point for me personally to understand more about the world more broadly, which I'm very grateful for.
Yeah, and especially the opportunity to travel there and
Hmm.
to really have that understanding, and I hope I can build on it too. I mean,
Hmm.
it's definitely not it's far from over. There's so much that I don't know and I haven't seen.
Yeah.
So I'd love to keep exploring and have a chance to go back too.
Hmm.
I was about to really get going on my horse riding skills. So
Yeah.
I
And
have a long
something
way to go.
about the Icelandic horses. I always think about this. They are like I think, the best type of horse for humans, just based on their size. It's like they're a human sized horse. It's easy to get on them. I look at
Right?
like the quote regular size horses, and it's like, why are they so big? Icelandic horses are like just so much more natural feeling.
I mean, slower, probably.
Yeah, no, they're fantastic, and that's a cool aspect. Yeah, you talked just earlier, and I would just like to throw this point out there as well, because I find it always interesting too when you're talking about the nature and the landscape and the animals that live there. And yeah, it's really interesting what you said there, the lack of biodiversity, and how it is, by any scientific measure, a very like kind of depleted landscape, but yet they really do well on a lot of regards to still have some agriculture. And of course, today there's much more technology that can help that, and like greenhouses and such, and utilizing geothermal energy. It's really amazing how, uh, yeah, just how creative the Icelanders have gotten, and built this basis
Yes.
on what in the past would have looked like, we're missing all these resources. Now, today, it's like we kind of idolize Iceland for being sustainable and green and utilizing what they have. And that's another really major difference I noticed too from
Yeah,
what
of
I'm
course.
used
I
to.
mean, they're always have been incredibly resourceful.
Hmm.
I mean, to survive like on so little that's given to you, but to make something out of it, I mean, it is really impressive.
Hmm.
I also think a lot of like food in Iceland is still imported, of
Yes.
course. And I had a really fascinating conversation with my cousin's partner about the EU trade agreement in 91, I
Hmm.
believe it was, when suddenly all of these new foods
Oh.
came in imported to Iceland all at once. And she's in her 50s or maybe exactly 50, not sure.
Mm.
But she remembers when she tried kiwi for the first time in 91, 92. And that's just such a cool memory. I mean,
Mm.
and also really interesting to think about the fact that the kiwis maybe weren't a thing, weren't
Yeah.
around. And now all of a sudden here they are. And again, that changes in the
Hmm.
last 30 years as well.
Yep.
So I think it's another, something else to your point
Hmm.
about the sort of change, the globalization,
Yep.
or maybe the Americanization
Hmm.
of the world of Iceland.
Yeah. And I'm happy that they can experience global cuisines like the rest of us can. But I would also be totally happy personally living there and existing only on lamb and potatoes and Icelandic cucumbers grown in the greenhouses, and skier and all of those sorts of foods.
Maybe you should have gone back in time then.
Well, it's
Personally, I love a kiwi, you know?
yeah, you're not wrong. It's nice to have options, I would say. Well, this has been a wonderful conversation, and we can maybe start to wrap it up. Is there any other stories or ideas or different things that you would like to express before we finish up our conversation?
I don't think so unless you had other ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, these topics are really endlessly fascinating, and I can talk and think about them forever. Um, But yeah, of course, we can always leave it there. I guess I could maybe ask: has this experience and your immersion into all the things that we've been discussing, has this like changed or shaped your idea about what you would like to do in the future, and kind of different maybe career paths that you see, and how this could maybe influence what you would like to do with yourself in the future as well?
Mm, I think maybe not change, but more like confirmed.
Hmm. Okay.
Confirmed that I really was on the right path and in this sort of global expansion of my life. And
Hmm.
especially studying immigration, it's something I'm
Hmm.
very passionate about. And I think the summer allowed me to pursue that even more
Yeah.
and sort of, confirmed, like you were saying, this desire to be elsewhere
Hmm.
and all the things that come with all the learning and all the personal growth that you experience through that. Definitely grew a lot this summer in such a short time.
Hmm.
But yeah, it was incredibly impactful to me, um, and definitely confirmed this sort of path forward of studying immigration and
Mm-hmm.
different cultures, and also what it means to have global cooperation.
Mm.
And that's something I'm very passionate about as well. And to not let the isolationist policies of the
Yeah.
US like constrict us and change, the global landscape, because the world is always more peaceful when we talk to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And that sort of, I mean, it's a lofty ideal, right? Global peace, but I think that it comes in small forms and it becomes so localized the more you live and experience in different places. And so, yeah, it's something I'm passionate about, and Iceland definitely helped sort of confirm that and put me on a path to pursue that further. So,
Mm. Yeah, well, I would say you certainly have some wonderful ideas. And
thank you. You
yeah,
too.
well, thank you. And I hope that you get another opportunity to go back to Iceland. And I would encourage anyone listening to this as well to try to pursue anything that they can do. I know that the Snorri program has some limitations to who is able to do it. Of course, there is an option for people in the older age range as well. But then Icelandic roots too. Like, for example, we have a volunteer trip. We did one, well, almost 2 years ago now. And then there will be another one next summer in 2025 for anyone who volunteers with Icelandic roots as an option to join us on that trip. And I think there's some, ideas going about to open up more sort of opportunities like that within Icelandic roots too. And even if Iceland isn't your thing, I hope that people can experience different countries and different cultures in this similar sort of way. I think we need a Snorri program for every culture and every country in the world.
Exactly.
Okay, Audrey, thank you very much for doing this with me. And bye for now, everyone.